The knock came at dawn, so faint it might have been wind against wood, but it carried a desperation that cut through the howling blizzard like a blade through silk. No one approached the iron gates on the hill without invitation, without trembling, without knowing they might never leave the same way they entered. But this wasn't the sound of a man seeking mercy or a rival testing boundaries. This was something else entirely, something that made the guards exchange uncertain glances through the swirling white chaos, their breath forming clouds as thick as the snow blanketing the ground beneath their boots. Inside the mansion, he stirred from restless sleep, his instincts sharper than any alarm system money could buy. The knock repeated, weaker this time, almost lost to the wind that rattled windows and shook the bare branches of trees like skeletal fingers clawing at the sky. He moved through darkened hallways where portraits of stern-faced men watched with painted eyes, his bare feet silent on marble floors cold enough to sting. Power lived in these walls, the kind that bent entire neighborhoods to its will, that made grown men stammer and politicians answer phones at midnight. The head of security appeared at the top of the stairs, his face tight with confusion that bordered on alarm. "Sir, there's someone at the gate," he said, the words careful, measured. "A child. Alone. She won't leave." Something in those words struck like a match in a room full of gasoline. Unexpected, dangerous, impossible to ignore. He descended the stairs without responding, pulling on the black coat that hung by the door like a second skin, its weight familiar as his own heartbeat. The cold hit him the moment he stepped outside, a wall of white and wind that stole breath and buried the world under layers of frozen silence. His boots crunched through snow already 6 inches deep, the sound lost immediately to the storm's roar. Through the ornate bars of the gate, he saw her, a shape so small it seemed impossible she'd survive the walk up the hill. Her coat was thin as paper, her hair crusted with ice crystals that caught what little light the dawn provided through the churning clouds above. She looked up when his shadow fell across her, and for a moment the wind seemed to pause, the world holding its breath. Her lips were blue, her small hands clutched around the bars with fingers that had gone white at the knuckles from cold and determination mixed in equal measure. "Sir," she whispered, and her voice was barely human, rasped raw by cold and crying. "My mom didn't come home last night." The words hung between them like a confession, like a prayer offered to the last person who should hear it. He'd heard pleas before, thousands of them, each one blending into the next until they became white noise against the soundtrack of his empire. But this wasn't a plea. This was a fact delivered by someone too young to understand that facts could be more dangerous than lies. The guards waited for his signal, for the dismissal that would send her back down the hill into the storm. Instead, he reached for the gate himself, his hands that had signed death warrants and broken unbreakable men, working the lock with fingers that suddenly felt clumsy, uncertain. The gate swung open with a groan of metal on metal, and she stumbled forward, her legs barely holding her upright. He caught her before she fell, and the weight of her was nothing, less than nothing, a bundle of frozen cloth and fragile bones that trembled like a bird's. "How long have you been walking?" he asked, and his voice came out different than intended, stripped of the edge that usually made subordinates flinch. She didn't answer, couldn't answer, her teeth chattering so violently that words became impossible between the shivers racking her tiny frame. He lifted her without thinking, cradling her against his chest where his coat could shield her from wind that wanted to tear her away. Her head fell against his shoulder, and through the layers of fabric he could feel how cold she'd become, how close to something irreversible. The walk back to the house seemed longer than it had moments before, each step deliberate, careful not to jostle her too roughly. Behind them, the gate clanged shut, sealing them inside walls that had never been meant for children, for innocence, for tiny frozen fingers that gripped his coat like it was the only solid thing left in a dissolving world. Inside, warmth hit like a physical force, but she didn't stop shivering, the cold too deep to be chased away by heated air alone. He carried her past startled staff who pressed themselves against walls, past rooms filled with expensive silence, straight to the library where a fireplace stretched from floor to ceiling like a mouth waiting to devour the cold. He set her down on the leather sofa nearest the flames, and for the first time in years found himself uncertain of what to do next, his hands hovering uselessly as she curled into herself, still shaking, still silent except for the desperate chatter of her teeth against the storm raging in her small body. The housekeeper appeared in the doorway with blankets before he could call for them, her maternal instincts overriding years of training that said never enter a room without permission. She wrapped the child in layers of wool and cashmere, her weathered hands efficient but gentle, clucking softly like she was handling injured wildlife rather than a human being who'd somehow survived the mountain in winter darkness. He stepped back, watching the flames catch and dance across wood that crackled and hissed, sending shadows across walls lined with books nobody read anymore. The child's breathing began to even out, the violent tremors gradually subsiding into occasional shivers that rippled through the blankets, cocooning her like aftershocks following an earthquake. "Hot chocolate," the housekeeper whispered, already moving toward the door. "And soup. The child needs—" But he raised one hand, stopping her mid-sentence, his eyes never leaving the small face that was slowly regaining color, pink creeping back into cheeks that had been gray as ash. When they were alone, he pulled a chair close to the sofa, sitting forward with his elbows on his knees, studying her the way he'd learned to study everything, looking for cracks, weaknesses, the truth hiding beneath whatever story was about to emerge. She watched him back, her eyes huge and dark, still glassy with cold but sharpening now, awareness returning like dawn breaking over frozen ground. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his voice low, unthreatening, the tone he'd perfected for negotiations that required patience rather than pressure. She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again, her voice coming out scratchy and small, barely louder than the fire's whisper. "Iris," she said, and the name hung between them, delicate as the flower it represented, out of place in this room where deals were made and empires were carved from other men's failures. She pulled the blankets tighter, her small fingers knotting in the fabric like she was afraid someone would take them away. "Iris," he repeated, tasting the word, finding it strange on his tongue. "You said your mother didn't come home. Where does she work?" The question was gentle, but beneath it lay the machinery of his mind already turning, already calculating possibilities, already preparing for whatever truth was coming. She shifted under the blankets, sitting up straighter, and he could see her gathering courage the way children do, all at once, in a rush, before fear could stop them. "At the Royal Diamond," she said, the words tumbling out faster now. "She works at the bar. She's always home by midnight, always, but last night she didn't come back." The name of the establishment hit him like ice water, recognition sharp and immediate. The Royal Diamond sat on the edge of his territory, a casino that wore respectability like a mask, but bled money from card games and private rooms, where limits didn't exist for those who could afford to lose them. He owned it through 3 shell companies and a chain of managers who knew better than to bother him with operational details. "She serves drinks," Iris continued, her voice gaining strength as she spoke, as if saying it out loud made it more real, more urgent. "Sometimes she doesn't finish until really late, but she always calls, always. She has a phone at the bar, and she calls me before she leaves, every single night, so I know she's coming." He watched her face as she spoke, seeing the fear there but also something else, a fierce certainty that her mother wouldn't abandon her, that something must have happened, that the world wouldn't simply swallow someone and leave no trace behind. It was the kind of faith that didn't exist in his world, where loyalty was bought and trust was a liability that got people killed. "Last night the phone didn't ring," she whispered, and her eyes filled with tears that didn't fall, held back by sheer will. "I waited and waited. I fell asleep on the couch by the phone. When I woke up it was still dark, and she wasn't there, and the apartment was so cold because we ran out of oil for the heater." The details painted a picture he didn't want to see. The small apartment, the single mother stretching every dollar until it screamed, the child waiting by a silent phone while snow buried the city outside. It was a reality that existed in the same world as his mansion, but they occupied different universes, never meant to intersect. "So you walked here," he said, not quite a question, still trying to understand the logic that would send a 6-year-old into a blizzard toward the one place in the city where innocents went to die. She nodded, wiping her nose with the back of her hand, a gesture so childlike it seemed impossible she'd just survived something that would have killed grown men. "Mrs. Chen next door said you're the boss of everything," Iris explained, her voice matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather rather than the criminal empire that made politicians nervous and rival families disappear. "She said if someone's missing, you're the only one who can find them. She said you're scary, but you're fair." Fair. The word echoed in his mind like a joke, like something from another life before he'd learned that fairness was a luxury for people who didn't understand how the world actually worked. But in this child's eyes, he saw belief, the kind that couldn't be faked or bought, that existed because someone had told her it was true, and she'd had no reason yet to learn about lies. The housekeeper returned with a tray, setting it on the low table with practiced silence. Steam rose from a mug of chocolate topped with melting marshmallows, and beside it sat a bowl of soup that filled the room with the smell of chicken and herbs, of comfort distilled into liquid warmth. Iris's eyes fixed on the food with an intensity that spoke of more than just the morning's ordeal, and he realized with a cold certainty that breakfast wasn't guaranteed in her world, that the hunger in her gaze came from a place deeper than one missed meal. She looked at him, asking permission without words, and he nodded, watching as she reached for the mug with both hands, holding it like it contained something precious and rare. He left her eating by the fire, her small hands wrapped around the mug as if it might disappear if she let go, and walked to his office where morning light struggled through windows frosted at the edges. His phone lay on the desk, silent and waiting, and he picked it up with fingers that had forgotten how to hesitate, dialing the number that connected him to the manager of the Royal Diamond without checking the time or caring that dawn was barely an hour old. The call was answered on the second ring, the manager's voice alert despite the early hour, trained to respond instantly when this particular number appeared on his screen. "Sir," he said, the single word carrying weight and worry, and the knowledge that calls at this hour meant someone had made a mistake that needed correcting. "You have a bartender who didn't go home last night," he said without preamble, his voice flat, stripped of anything that might be mistaken for concern. "Woman, probably late 20s, has a daughter. Find out where she is. Find out now." There was a pause, the sound of sheets rustling, feet hitting floor, the manager's breathing quickening as the implications settled into his consciousness. "Sir, we close at 4, the cleaning crew leaves by 5. I don't know of anyone who—" The words stumbled over each other, panic making them clumsy. "You have 15 minutes, he interrupted, each word precise as a knife cut. "Call me back with answers or call me back with your resignation. Those are your only options." He ended the call before the manager could respond, setting the phone down with controlled care that belied the strange urgency building in his chest like pressure before a storm. Through the window, the city sprawled below the hill, white and silent, under snow that continued falling, softer now but relentless, erasing roads and landmarks until everything looked the same. Somewhere down there, in the maze of streets and buildings, a woman was missing, and a child sat by his fireplace believing he could fix it because someone had told her bosses fix things. He'd built his empire on information, on knowing everything that happened in his territory before it became a problem, on networks of eyes and ears that reported back like nerves feeding data to a brain. But this, a bartender who disappeared after her shift, this had slipped through every crack, invisible until a 6-year-old walked through a blizzard to tell him about it. The phone rang, 12 minutes later, and he answered it before the second ring could complete. "Talk," he said, and the single word carried the weight of consequence, of time running out, of patience stretched thin as wire. "Found her," the manager gasped, his relief palpable even through the digital connection. "She's here. She's still here, sir. She collapsed in the break room after her shift. The overnight supervisor didn't check the back rooms, didn't know she was there. She's burning up with fever, keeps trying to stand up but she can't. She's delirious." He was moving before the manager finished speaking, his body responding to something he didn't fully understand, some instinct that had no place in his carefully controlled world. He grabbed his coat from where he'd thrown it over a chair, his keys, his phone, his mind already racing through routes and timing and what he'd do when he got there. The garage held 12 cars, each one chosen for specific purposes: speed, intimidation, anonymity, depending on what the situation required. He chose the black SUV with tinted windows, built like a tank but faster than anything its size had a right to be, opening the driver's door himself instead of waiting for someone else to do it because waiting felt impossible, unbearable. The engine roared to life, and he backed out into the snow with controlled violence, the wheels finding purchase on the cleared driveway before hitting the unplowed road that wound down from the hill. The city opened before him, empty at this hour, the storm having chased everyone inside except those with nowhere else to go. He drove fast but not recklessly, his hand steady on the wheel, his mind already in the casino, already seeing what needed to happen next. The Royal Diamond announced itself with neon signs dulled by daylight and snow, its parking lot empty except for a few cars belonging to cleaning staff and dealers who'd worked through the night. The front entrance stood locked, but he had keys to every door in every building he owned, and within seconds he was inside, moving through the main floor where slot machines sat silent and gaming tables waited under protective covers. The smell of stale cigarettes and spilled alcohol hung in the air, mixed with industrial cleaner and the peculiar emptiness of spaces meant to be crowded, now abandoned. He found the manager waiting by the back hallway, his face pale, his hands twisting together. "Sir, I'm so sorry. We didn't know. The protocol is to check all rooms, but the night supervisor is new and he didn't realize." The excuses poured out in a flood, but he walked past without acknowledging them, following the hallway to where it opened into a small break room with lockers and a table and a couch against one wall. She lay there, half on and half off the worn cushions, her body curled into itself, trembling despite the blanket someone had thrown over her. Her face was flushed with fever, her hair stuck to her forehead with sweat, her lips moving soundlessly, forming words that might have been her daughter's name or might have been pleas to forces that weren't listening. He crossed the room in 3 strides, dropping to one knee beside the couch, his hand reaching for her forehead before he could think better of it. Heat radiated from her skin like she was burning from the inside, and when his fingers made contact, her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy, seeing something that wasn't him, wasn't the room, wasn't anything real. "Iris," she whispered, the name cracking in her throat. "Have to get home. She's waiting. She's alone." The words ran together, slurred by fever and exhaustion, but the desperation in them was clear, sharp as broken glass, cutting through everything else. "She's not alone," he said, surprised by his own voice, by the gentleness he didn't know he could produce. "She's safe. She came to find me." He wasn't sure if the woman heard him, if his words penetrated the fog of sickness, but her eyes found his for just a moment, recognition flickering like a candle in wind before going out again. He lifted her the way he'd lifted her daughter hours earlier, feeling how light she was, how fragile, her body weighing almost nothing despite being full-grown. She didn't resist, didn't seem aware enough to understand what was happening, her head falling against his shoulder as he stood, adjusting his grip to support her more securely. The manager held the back door open as he carried her through, the cold air hitting them both like a physical blow after the stale warmth of the break room. Snow had accumulated in the alley during the hours she'd lain unconscious, creating drifts that reached halfway up the dumpsters lining the brick walls on either side. He moved carefully, his boots finding purchase on ice hidden beneath fresh powder, his arms tightening around her when she stirred slightly, mumbling words that dissolved into incoherent sounds. The SUV waited where he'd left it, engine still running, exhaust creating clouds in the frozen air that dissipated almost instantly in the wind. Getting her into the back seat required maneuvering through the narrow space between door and frame, supporting her weight while adjusting angles, finally settling her across the leather seats with her head propped against the armrest. He removed his coat, covering her with it, the black wool swallowing her small frame, until only her face remained visible, pale and feverish in the gray morning light. The drive to the hospital carved through streets that were coming alive with early risers, delivery trucks and snowplows beginning their routes, brake lights flashing red against white as the city shook off night. He wove through traffic with practiced efficiency, one eye on the road and one on the rearview mirror where he could see her reflection, motionless except for the shallow rise and fall of her breathing. His phone rang 3 times during the 15-minute drive, and 3 times he ignored it, letting calls go to voicemail because nothing in his business required attention more urgently than the woman dying slowly in his back seat. The realization struck him like a blow, that he'd made a choice without thinking, that priorities he'd held for years had shifted in the space of a few hours, rearranged by a child's desperate walk through a blizzard. The hospital appeared ahead, its emergency entrance marked by red signs that glowed even in daylight. Ambulances parked at angles that suggested recent chaos now subsided. He pulled directly up to the doors, ignoring the no parking warnings painted in yellow letters on the concrete, cutting the engine, and moving to the back seat in one fluid motion. She felt lighter than before, as if the fever was burning away substance, leaving only the essential parts, bone and breath and stubborn will that kept her heart beating despite everything working against it. He kicked the car door shut with his heel, not caring about the noise, striding toward the automatic doors that whooshed open to admit them into harsh fluorescent lighting and the smell of antiseptic. The triage nurse looked up from her computer screen, her professional assessment taking in the scene instantly, the expensive suit carrying the unconscious woman, the authority in his posture that said he expected immediate action, the way he moved like someone accustomed to having obstacles removed before he reached them. She was on her feet before he spoke, already reaching for a phone, already calling for a gurney. High fever, unconscious for at least 6 hours, possible exposure to cold, he said. His voice clipped, efficient, delivering information like a diagnosis rather than a plea. She has a 6-year-old daughter waiting for her. She needs help now. 2 orderlies appeared with a wheeled stretcher, their hands reaching to take her from him, and for a moment his arms tightened, resistance flaring before logic overrode it. He lowered her onto the thin mattress, watching as they secured straps and checked vital signs, their movements practiced and quick, their faces betraying nothing about what they saw or thought. They wheeled her away through double doors that swung shut with finality, leaving him standing in the middle of the emergency room with his coat still in the back seat and his hands empty for the first time in hours. Around him, other people waited, a man holding a bloody towel to his hand, a mother with a coughing child, lives intersecting with crisis in a space designed to catch people when they fell. He approached the registration desk where a woman with tired eyes looked up from a clipboard, her fingers poised over a keyboard. "I need information on her condition," he said, and it wasn't a request, wasn't phrased like something that could be denied, but the woman's expression didn't change. Professional courtesy armored against intimidation. "Are you family?" she asked. The question routine, required by regulations that didn't care about power or influence or how many buildings someone owned. The word hung between them. Family. Simple and loaded, meaning everything and nothing depending on context, blood, law, bonds that transcended paperwork. "No," he admitted, the truth strange on his tongue, acknowledging limitation in a life built on breaking through limitations. "But her daughter is at my house. She's 6. She walked through a blizzard to ask me to find her mother, so I found her." The woman's expression softened slightly, something human breaking through the professional mask. "I'll make a note in the file," she said, her voice gentler now, "but I can't guarantee the doctors will speak with you. Privacy laws are strict, and without consent or legal relationship." She trailed off, the unfinished sentence containing volumes about rules and regulations and the walls they built between people. He nodded, understanding but not accepting, already planning ways around obstacles that hadn't materialized yet. "Her name," he said, realizing for the first time that he didn't know it, that the woman he'd carried twice now remained nameless in his mind, defined only by her relationship to a child who'd appeared at his gate. "What's her name?" The question seemed to surprise the registration clerk, her eyebrows rising slightly. "You don't know her name?" she asked, confusion evident, trying to reconcile the intensity of his actions with this fundamental gap in information. "You brought her here without knowing her name?" "The daughter's name is Iris," he said, as if that explained everything, as if the child's identity somehow encompassed the mother's, made introductions unnecessary. "The mother works at the Royal Diamond, bartending the night shift. That's all I know." The clerk typed something, her fingers moving across keys with efficiency, born from years of processing emergencies. "There are forms," she began, pulling papers from a drawer, setting them on the counter with a pen. "Emergency contact, insurance information, medical history. Someone needs to fill these out, and if you're not family—" "I'll handle it," he interrupted, taking the pen before she could finish explaining why he shouldn't, why he couldn't, why regulations existed to prevent exactly this kind of irregular involvement. He moved to one of the plastic chairs bolted to the floor and rose, sitting down among strangers who clutched their own emergencies, and began filling out forms with information he'd have to invent, gaps he'd have to bridge with money and connections and the weight of influence that usually made paperwork disappear entirely. His phone buzzed insistently, messages piling up, missed calls multiplying, his empire demanding attention that felt suddenly distant and irrelevant. He thought of Iris by the fireplace, probably awake now, probably asking questions, probably waiting with the same patience she'd shown, waiting by a silent phone in a cold apartment while her mother burned with fever in a locked casino. The wait stretched into hours that felt suspended outside normal time, minutes crawling past on the wall clock, while the emergency room cycled through its parade of human suffering. He remained in the plastic chair, forms completed with half-truths and assumptions, his phone now silenced completely, the world beyond these walls put on hold by a decision he hadn't consciously made, but couldn't unmake. A doctor finally emerged through the double doors, scanning the waiting area with eyes that had seen too many long shifts, her scrubs wrinkled and coffee-stained. She approached the desk, spoke quietly with the clerk, and then turned toward him with the deliberate walk of someone delivering news that required careful words, measured tones, professional distance from outcomes that might break either way. "She's stable," the doctor said, and those two words carried relief like oxygen after drowning. "Severe case of influenza complicated by exhaustion and dehydration. Her immune system was already compromised, probably been running on empty for weeks, maybe months. Another few hours without treatment and we'd be having a different conversation." He absorbed the information in silence, his mind already calculating recovery time, complications, what came next. The doctor continued, pulling a small notepad from her pocket and flipping through pages covered in cramped handwriting that looked like a language only medical professionals could decode. "She's asking for her daughter," the doctor said, looking up from her notes. "She's awake but disoriented, keeps trying to get out of bed. We've sedated her lightly, but she's fighting it, insisting she needs to get home. I told her someone brought her in, that her daughter is safe, but she won't rest until she sees the child herself." The words painted a picture of desperation that transcended illness. Maternal instinct overriding survival instinct, the need to protect her child stronger than the body's demand for healing. He understood that kind of drive, had seen it in men defending territory or honor, but this was different, purer somehow, untainted by pride or profit or the complicated mathematics of power. "Bring the daughter here," he said, standing, the decision forming even as he spoke it. "Let her see that her mother is alive and being cared for. Then they both need somewhere to recover that isn't a hospital room or whatever apartment they've been surviving in." The doctor's expression shifted, professional neutrality cracking slightly to reveal curiosity mixed with wariness. "And you're offering that somewhere?" she asked, the question carrying implications about motivations and intentions, about men in expensive suits who appeared with unconscious women and made declarations about their futures. "I have space," he said simply, not explaining further, not justifying what didn't require justification in his own mind. "More than enough space. She needs rest, proper food, warmth, time to heal without worrying about rent or shifts or how she'll manage. The child needs her mother healthy. I can provide those things." The doctor studied him for a long moment, her evaluation clinical and thorough, looking for red flags that years of emergency medicine had taught her to recognize. Whatever she saw, or didn't see, made her nod slowly, accepting the arrangement even as questions remained unasked in her eyes. "She'll need to stay here for at least 48 hours, the doctor said, her voice returning to professional efficiency. "IV fluids, monitoring, antibiotics to knock down the infection. After that, if someone's available to care for her at home, we can discharge her with prescriptions and follow-up appointments, but she cannot return to work for at least 2 weeks, possibly longer depending on how she responds to treatment. 2 weeks without income, 2 weeks of rent coming due and bills piling up, and a child who needed to eat every day regardless of circumstances." The math was simple and brutal, the kind that pushed people back to work before they were ready, that turned minor illnesses into major ones through neglect born from necessity rather than choice. He pulled out his phone, typing a message to the housekeeper with instructions that were clear and non-negotiable. Prepare a room, something warm for the child, a car to bring her to the hospital within the hour. The response came back immediately. One word: understood. No questions, no hesitation, just obedience that came from years of knowing when not to ask why. "I need to see her," he said, the words surprising him even as they emerged. "Before I bring the daughter, I need to see that she's actually stable, that she'll survive this." The vulnerability in the request felt foreign, uncomfortable, like wearing clothes that didn't fit quite right. The doctor considered this, weighing protocols against the unusual circumstances, then gestured toward the double doors. 5 minutes, she said. "She's sedated but responsive. Don't upset her. Don't make promises about her daughter that you can't keep. And if any monitors start beeping, you step back and let us work." He followed her through corridors that smelled of bleach and human suffering, past rooms where curtains concealed private agonies, where machines beeped rhythms that meant life continuing despite everything trying to stop it. They stopped at a room near the end of the hall, the doctor pulling back a curtain to reveal a space barely large enough for the bed and equipment crowding around it. She lay there connected to tubes and wires, an IV drip feeding clear liquid into her arm, monitors tracking the basic functions that defined existence: heartbeat, oxygen, blood pressure. Her eyes were closed, her face no longer flushed with fever but pale now, drained, dark circles underneath suggesting exhaustion that went deeper than one bad shift or one missed night of sleep. He stepped closer, his shoes silent on tile floors, stopping beside the bed where he could see the slight rise and fall of her chest, evidence of life persisting. Up close, he could see details missed in the chaos of finding her, the calluses on her hands from years of carrying heavy trays, the worry lines around her eyes that made her seem older than she probably was, the evidence of a life spent surviving rather than living. Her eyes opened slowly, fighting the sedation, focusing on him with effort that seemed to cost her everything she had left. Recognition flickered, not of him specifically, but of the moment in the break room, fragmented memories assembling themselves into something resembling coherence. "Iris," she whispered, the name barely audible, her voice raw from fever and fear. "You said she was safe. You said—" The words broke apart, too much effort required to push them into the air between them, but the question in her eyes needed no voice to be heard. "She's coming here," he said, leaning closer so she wouldn't have to strain to hear him. "In less than an hour, she'll walk through that door and see that you're alive. And then you're both coming home with me until you're strong enough to decide what happens next." Confusion crossed her face, followed by something that might have been fear, or might have been the last defense of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of help, because it always came with strings attached. But she was too weak to argue, too sick to muster the energy for protests, and somewhere beneath the confusion and fear, he saw relief, small and tentative, but real. "Why?" she managed, the single syllable containing volumes of questions about motivations and intentions, about men like him and women like her, and how their worlds weren't supposed to intersect except in transactions that left one person diminished and the other enriched. He didn't have an answer that made sense, not one he could articulate in a way that wouldn't sound like lies or delusions. So he simply said, "Because your daughter walked through a blizzard to ask me to. Because she believed I could help. Because maybe she was right." The black car arrived at the hospital entrance precisely when instructed, the housekeeper in the passenger seat and Iris visible through the window, her small face pressed against the glass, eyes scanning the building with desperate hope. He met them at the door, and the moment the child saw him, she burst from the vehicle before it fully stopped, her feet hitting pavement at a run, her voice calling out questions that tumbled over each other in her urgency. "Is she here? Did you find her? Is she okay? Can I see her?" The words came without pause for breath, her hands gripping his coat when she reached him, looking up with eyes that had probably cried themselves empty during the hours of waiting, now refilling with tears that threatened to spill over at any moment. He knelt down to her level, bringing his face even with hers, a position he'd never taken with anyone in his adult life, this gesture of making himself smaller, vulnerable, meeting someone where they stood rather than forcing them to reach up. "She's alive," he said, watching relief break across her face like sunrise. "She's sick, but the doctors are helping her. She's been asking for you." The transformation was immediate and complete, fear dissolving into joy so pure it hurt to witness, her small arms throwing themselves around his neck in an embrace that caught him completely unprepared. He froze for a moment, uncertain how to respond, then slowly brought his arms up to return the gesture, patting her back awkwardly, feeling the fragility of her shoulder blades through her coat like bird bones that might snap under pressure. "Thank you," she whispered against his shoulder, the words muffled but clear, carrying weight that pressed against his chest like a physical force. "Thank you for finding her. Thank you for bringing her back." And in that moment, something inside him that had been frozen for longer than he could remember began to crack, ice giving way to something he didn't have words for, didn't know how to name. The housekeeper watched this exchange with an expression carefully neutral, but eyes betraying surprise, having worked in his home for 15 years without once seeing him touch anyone with gentleness, without witnessing any interaction that suggested capacity for tenderness. She cleared her throat softly, reminding them of time and purpose, and he stood, taking Iris's hand in his, another unfamiliar gesture that felt both strange and oddly natural. They walked through corridors that seemed less harsh with the child beside him, her presence somehow softening the clinical edges, making the hospital feel less like a way station between living and dying, and more like a place where healing actually happened. Nurses smiled at Iris as they passed, and he realized they were responding to her specifically, to the hope she carried like a visible light. The doctor met them outside the room, kneeling down to Iris's level the way he had, speaking in tones reserved for children who needed truth delivered gently. "Your mom is very sick, but she's getting better," she explained, her voice warm and professional. "She has tubes helping her get medicine and water. Don't be scared when you see them. They're helping her heal." Iris nodded solemnly, her hand tightening in his, drawing strength or offering it. He couldn't tell which. Then the doctor stepped aside, pulling back the curtain, and the child rushed forward with a cry that was half sob, half laugh, pure relief given voice in a sound that echoed down the hallway and made other patients look up from their own struggles. "Mama!" Iris climbed onto the bed with practiced efficiency, clearly having done this before, finding space beside her mother without disturbing tubes or wires, her small body curling into the woman's side like a puzzle piece finding its match. The mother's arms came up to hold her daughter, and in that gesture he saw everything, love and fear and relief and exhaustion, all wound together into something so powerful it made the machines and medicine seem almost irrelevant. He stepped back, giving them space, watching from the doorway as they whispered to each other, as the mother's hands moved through her daughter's hair, checking her over with the thoroughness of someone who'd worried about every possible harm. The housekeeper appeared beside him, and together they stood guard over this reunion, witnessing something that felt almost sacred in its intensity. "She's really okay?" Iris asked, pulling back slightly to look at her mother's face, needing visual confirmation beyond the embrace. "You promise you're not going to disappear again?" The question carried undertones of every fear a child could hold, of abandonment and loss and a world that might take away the one constant in an unstable life. "I promise, baby," the mother whispered, and her eyes found his over Iris's head, holding his gaze with something that might have been gratitude or might have been challenge, asking silently what his involvement meant, what price would eventually be demanded for the help he'd offered. "I'm not going anywhere. We're not going anywhere." The weight of those words settled over him like a vow he hadn't asked for, but somehow accepted anyway. The mother continued holding his gaze, her expression unreadable, and he saw in her eyes the same fierce protectiveness he'd recognized in Iris, a determination to survive, to shield her daughter from harm, to do whatever necessary to keep them both safe, even if it meant accepting help from a stranger whose reputation probably preceded him into this room. "The doctor says you need rest," he said, breaking the silence that had stretched too long. "Weeks of it, without worrying about rent or food or shifts. I have a house with more empty rooms than I know what to do with. You'll stay there until you're well." It wasn't a question or an invitation, but a statement of fact, and he watched her process this, watched her mind working through implications and options, and whether pride was a luxury she could afford. Iris looked between them, sensing the tension, her small hand reaching for her mother's, ready to advocate for whatever kept them together. "I don't accept charity," the mother said finally, her voice stronger now despite the IV and the fever still lingering in her system. "I work for what we have. I don't owe anyone anything except what I can pay back with my own hands." The words carried dignity that circumstances couldn't diminish, a refusal to be reduced to someone who needed saving. "Then work for me," he said, the solution presenting itself even as he spoke. "When you're well, my house runs on staff who manage everything from meals to maintenance. You can join them, work off whatever debt you think you owe, and your daughter will have a safe place to grow up while you do." The offer hung in the air between them, and he saw her weighing it, testing it for hidden traps, looking for the catch that always existed in arrangements that seemed too good to be true. But Iris's face brightened, her hope uncomplicated by adult cynicism, and that seemed to tip the balance more than any argument he could have made. "Until I'm well," the mother said slowly, each word measured, establishing boundaries even as she accepted help. "Until I can afford my own place again. Not forever, just until I'm strong enough to stand on my own." The conditions were clear, her independence non-negotiable even in dependency, and he found himself respecting that, understanding the need to maintain some sense of control when everything else had been taken by circumstances beyond her power. "Until you're ready to leave," he agreed, and meant it, though something in his chest tightened at the thought of the empty rooms filling and then emptying again, of life briefly interrupting the silence before returning him to the solitude he'd built so carefully around himself, however long that takes. The mansion transformed in ways too subtle for outsiders to notice, but profound enough that longtime staff exchanged glances when they thought no one was watching. The East Wing, closed for years and maintained only by weekly dusting, suddenly filled with purpose as rooms were prepared, linens aired, furniture uncovered from protective sheets that had turned them into ghosts of comfort waiting to be resurrected. The housekeeper moved through these preparations with efficiency that masked her curiosity. directing younger staff to scrub windows until they caught sunlight, to stock closets with towels soft enough for a child's skin. She asked no questions about why or for how long, understanding that some changes arrived without explanation and required only adaptation, not understanding. He spent those 2 days before the mother's discharge, attending to business that had accumulated during his absence, sitting through meetings where men reported numbers and problems. But his mind wandered in ways it never had before, drifting to hospital rooms and small hands gripping his coat, to promises made without thinking through their implications. The city noticed too, though in different ways through different channels. Word spread among those who made it their business to know things, that the boss had personally retrieved someone from the Royal Diamond, that he'd carried her into a hospital himself. Speculation ran wild in the absence of facts, theories multiplying in whispered conversations held in back rooms and dark corners where his influence didn't quite reach. His lieutenants approached with careful words and cautious expressions, asking questions disguised as concerns about security, about precedent, about what this meant for operations. He shut them down with looks that said the subject wasn't open for discussion, that his private affairs remained private, regardless of curiosity or concern. But the questions lingered in the air like smoke, following him through his days. What was he doing? Why was he doing it? What did it mean? He had no answers, or none he could articulate in ways that made sense even to himself. None that explained why a man who'd built walls between himself and everyone else was suddenly opening doors to strangers. The morning of the discharge arrived cold and clear, the storm having passed, leaving everything covered in pristine white that would turn to gray slush within hours. He drove to the hospital himself again, dismissing the driver who'd appeared with keys and questions, needing the solitude of the vehicle, the rhythm of navigation through streets that demanded attention. The mother sat on the edge of the hospital bed fully dressed when he arrived, wearing the same clothes she'd collapsed in, now cleaned and pressed by hospital laundry. Iris sat beside her, swinging her legs that didn't quite reach the floor, chattering about the room that was waiting, about the house on the hill that she'd described in terms that made it sound like a castle from storybooks. "Ready?" he asked from the doorway, and the mother looked up, her expression unreadable but eyes clear now, fever-free. She stood slowly, testing her strength, one hand on Iris's shoulder for balance or reassurance, maybe both, her body language broadcasting uncertainty about what came next. The discharge process took longer than it should have, nurses providing instructions for medications and follow-up appointments, doctors signing forms that released responsibility from hospital to whoever would provide care. He stood back during this, letting the mother handle the paperwork herself, respecting the independence she'd insisted on, even while knowing she'd be relying on him for everything that mattered. The drive back was quiet, Iris filling silence with observations about snow and buildings and people walking bundled against cold. The mother sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes on the road ahead, not speaking, but present in a way that felt heavy with thoughts she wasn't sharing. The mansion appeared as they rounded the final curve of the hill road, and he watched the mother's expression change as she took in the scope of it. The iron gates, the stone walls, the windows that reflected morning light like judgmental eyes watching their approach. Iris pressed her face to the window, excitement undiminished by grandeur, but the mother's face tightened. The gates opened automatically, sensors recognizing the vehicle, and they swept through onto grounds maintained with precision that turned nature into art. Every tree trimmed, every path cleared, everything controlled and perfect, and utterly unlike the messy reality of the lives entering it, the contrast impossible to ignore. The car stopped at the main entrance, where the housekeeper waited with 2 younger staff members, their faces carefully neutral. "Welcome," she said. The word simple but weighted with meaning that went beyond politeness, an acknowledgement that thresholds were being crossed, that normal procedures were being set aside for circumstances that defied normal categorization. The mother hesitated at the base of the steps, her body language broadcasting resistance even as her situation offered no alternatives. He came around the car, stopping beside her but not touching, not pushing, giving her space to make the choice herself, even though the choice had already been made days ago in a hospital room. "It's just a house," he said quietly, for her ears only. Bigger than most, but still just rooms and walls and places to sleep safely. The lie tasted strange. They both knew it wasn't just a house, that accepting shelter here came with invisible strings that might take months or years to become visible. She looked at him then, really looked, searching his face for something, truth or deception, danger or safety, the answer to questions she didn't know how to ask. Whatever she saw made her nod once, sharp and decisive, then turn toward the entrance where her daughter waited, bouncing on her toes with impatience and excitement, uncomplicated by adult fears. Inside, the house revealed itself in layers. The grand foyer with its chandelier that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. The sweeping staircase that divided into two paths. The mother's eyes tracked everything, cataloging details, assessing value, and he wondered what calculations she was making, what price she thought would eventually be demanded for all this temporary shelter. The housekeeper led them upstairs, narrating as she went, in tones that suggested she'd given this tour before, but never to people quite like this. The library, the sitting rooms, the dining room that seated 20, each space larger than the entire apartment they'd left behind, excess compounding with each revealed room, until the mother's expression grew more guarded. Weeks passed like water finding new paths, reshaping the landscape of his life in ways so gradual he barely noticed, until he looked back and couldn't recognize the terrain anymore. The house that had been silent except for staff movements began to hold different sounds. Iris's laughter echoing down hallways that had never heard children, the mother's voice humming quietly while she worked. The staff adapted with the flexibility of people accustomed to serving without questioning, though he caught them smiling when Iris appeared asking impossible questions. The housekeeper particularly seemed transformed, her stern efficiency softening around edges that had grown hard from years of maintaining order in empty rooms that now overflowed with life. He found himself adjusting his schedule in subtle ways, returning from meetings earlier than necessary, taking morning coffee in the breakfast room instead of his office. These changes happened without decision, without conscious choice, his body and routines responding to presences he hadn't known he'd been missing, until they filled spaces he'd convinced himself were complete. The mother recovered slowly, color returning to her face, strength rebuilding in increments measured by longer walks through the gardens. She insisted on contributing despite his protests, taking over small tasks with determination that bordered on stubbornness, establishing her presence as worker rather than guest, even when the distinction seemed meaningless to everyone but her. Iris thrived in ways that suggested she'd been held back by circumstances too heavy for small shoulders to carry alone. She explored every corner of the house and grounds with fearless curiosity, befriending the gardener and the cook and the younger staff members who'd never had reason to interact with children before. Her drawings began appearing on walls in the hallways, taped up by the housekeeper who'd asked no permission, but anticipated no objection. He found himself pausing to study them, crude representations of houses and people, and dogs they didn't have, but she apparently wanted, each one a window into hopes that had been deferred by survival, but never quite extinguished. The city continued its whispers, speculation evolving as weeks passed without clarification or explanation. His business partners approached him with questions wrapped in concern, noting changes in his demeanor, in his availability, in the way he sometimes seemed distracted during negotiations. He deflected these inquiries with practiced ease, revealing nothing while acknowledging everything, maintaining the mystery because the truth was something he barely understood himself. Christmas approached with commercial inevitability, the city decorating itself in lights and manufactured cheer while temperatures dropped and snow returned. The staff began preparations for holidays he'd never celebrated beyond obligatory dinners with business associates who expected traditions to be observed like contracts, binding but meaningless beyond their performance. This year felt different, even before anyone suggested it should be. Iris talked constantly about Christmas, with the enthusiasm of a child who'd received promises of better things, who believed in magic because she'd witnessed her own small miracle. The mother listened to these excited plans with expressions that cycled between joy for her daughter and worry about expectations that couldn't possibly be met. He found himself making decisions that surprised him, approving a tree for the main foyer when the housekeeper mentioned it, authorizing purchases of decorations that had never been necessary before, even driving to a lot on the edge of town where families wandered among rows of evergreens, choosing the one that felt right, in ways that had nothing to do with symmetry or practical considerations. Iris came with him, her hand in his now as naturally as breathing, her opinions firm about which tree had the best shape, the fullest branches. They brought it back strapped to the SUV's roof, and the mother stood on the front steps watching their arrival, with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between gratitude and trepidation, happiness and fear. That night, they decorated together, all of them, staff abandoning usual boundaries to hang ornaments and string lights, while Iris directed operations. The mother worked beside the housekeeper, their hands occasionally touching as they passed decorations, their voices quiet with conversation he couldn't hear, but could sense carried weight beyond small talk. Days shortened as winter solstice approached, darkness arriving early and lasting long. But inside the mansion, lights blazed with warmth that felt genuine rather than decorative. Meals became longer, conversation flowing more easily. Iris telling stories about school she'd started attending after weeks of being tutored at home. The mother sharing memories of Christmases past. He contributed little to these exchanges, content mostly to listen, to observe, to witness something he'd never had. This sense of family assembling itself from disparate parts. The business continued running with minimal input, his lieutenants having learned to handle day-to-day operations, without constant supervision, freeing him to be present in ways he'd never allowed himself before. The mother grew stronger daily, her body recovering fully from the illness that had nearly killed her. But she made no moves toward leaving. He didn't ask about her plans, afraid that asking would force decisions that benefited from remaining unmade, that existed in comfortable ambiguity rather than definite resolution that might shatter everything. But he thought about it constantly, about what came next, about whether temporary could become permanent, about whether the feelings he didn't have words for yet translated into something. The question formed and reformed in his mind, taking different shapes, testing different phrasings, none of them adequate to express what he meant, without revealing too much about vulnerabilities he'd spent decades learning to hide. Christmas Eve arrived with fresh snow falling gently, the kind that made the world look clean and possible rather than buried and cold. The mansion had been transformed by weeks of preparation, every room decorated with care that suggested holidays meant something beyond obligation, beyond performance, beyond anything he'd experienced in adult life. The staff had been given time off, sent home to their own families with bonuses that made several of them cry. They ate dinner in the smaller dining room, the one that seated only 6, candles flickering on the table between them, while snow continued falling outside windows that reflected their images back at them like portraits of something that could be mistaken for belonging. After dinner, they moved to the library where the fire had been built up to roaring warmth. Iris settled on the floor with new coloring books while the mother sat on the sofa with tea steaming in her hands, her eyes on her daughter but her mind clearly elsewhere, working through thoughts that showed in the slight furrow between her brows. He'd been planning this moment for days, rehearsing in his mind while simultaneously convincing himself not to do it, that it was too soon, too presumptuous. But watching them there, Iris's tongue sticking out slightly in concentration, the mother's profile in firelight, he knew that waiting wouldn't make the asking easier or the answer more certain. He crossed to where a small box sat hidden in the drawer of a side table, his hands steady despite the unfamiliar sensation of nervousness. He'd chosen the ring himself, spending hours in a jeweler's private room looking at options that all seemed either too ostentatious or too insignificant, finally selecting something simple, a single diamond on a plain gold band. "There's something I need to ask you both," he said, and his voice came out different than intended, stripped of the authority that usually made people lean forward. Iris looked up from her coloring, her eyes curious, while the mother set down her tea with hands that trembled slightly, some instinct telling her that whatever came next would change everything. He knelt down on the carpet between them, position putting him at Iris's level, but also making him look up at the mother. The box in his hand seemed to grow heavier with each passing second, containing possibilities that could be accepted or rejected, futures that might materialize or dissolve depending on words not yet spoken. "When Iris came to my gate that morning," he began, focusing on the child first because her acceptance felt somehow more achievable than her mother's. "She asked me for help, and I want to keep helping, not because of obligation or debt, but because somewhere between that morning and now, you both became important to me in ways I don't fully understand and can't properly explain." Iris watched him with complete attention, her coloring forgotten, her small hands folded in her lap in unconscious mimicry of her mother's posture. The mother sat frozen, her breath held, her eyes wide with something that might have been hope, or might have been fear that hope itself was dangerous, that letting it in meant risking devastation if it proved unfounded. "I'm not good at this," he admitted, the confession feeling like removing armor that had protected him for so long. He'd forgotten what it felt like to stand exposed. "I don't know how families work. I don't know how to be what you need. But I want to learn. I want to try. I want you to stay," he said finally, The words simple but carrying everything he couldn't articulate. Loneliness acknowledged. Walls crumbling. Not as guests. Not as staff. As family. As mine if you'll have me. As mine if I can be yours. If that's something you could imagine wanting too. He opened the box, revealing the ring that suddenly seemed inadequate, too small to represent what he was asking. The diamond caught firelight and threw it back in fractured rainbows. Beauty born from pressure applied over time to something that started as coal and became treasure through transformation. He was only now beginning to understand. "Will you marry me?" he asked the mother, but his eyes included Iris in the question, acknowledging that accepting him meant accepting the world he came from. "Both of you. Will you let me keep you safe? Will you let me come home to you? Will you stay and build something here that none of us knew we needed until it already existed?" Silence stretched for heartbeats that felt like hours. The fire crackling the only sound. Snow tapping gently against windows like witnesses waiting for vows. The mother's eyes filled with tears that spilled over, tracking down her cheeks in paths that carved through defenses she'd maintained since the moment she'd woken in a hospital bed to find her life rearranged. "You don't know us," she whispered, but the protest sounded weak even to his ears, less argument than plea for reassurance. "You don't know who we are, where we come from, what baggage we carry. This could be a mistake. This could end badly. This could—" "I know you walked through a blizzard for her," he interrupted gently, gesturing to Iris, whose eyes tracked between them with intensity. "I know you worked yourself sick trying to provide. I know you taught her to be brave enough to ask strangers for help. I know when I hold either of you, something in me that was missing clicks into place." Iris moved then, launching herself at him with the explosive energy children possessed, her arms wrapping around his neck with force that nearly knocked him backward. "Yes," she shouted directly into his ear, joy uncontained and uncomplicated by adult concerns. "Say yes, Mama. Say yes so we can stay forever and you never have to work so hard you get sick again." The mother laughed through her tears, the sound breaking something loose in the room, tension releasing like pressure valve opened to prevent explosion. She reached forward, one hand touching his face with fingers that trembled, tracing the line of his jaw as if checking he was real, solid, actually kneeling before her with a ring and a question. "Yes," she said, and the word came out choked with emotions too tangled to separate, relief and fear and joy and terror and hope. "Yes, we'll stay. Yes, we'll build something. Yes, we'll let you love us, and we'll figure out how to love you back, even though this is crazy, and shouldn't work, and probably won't be easy." He kissed her then, stopping the flow of words with lips that had forgotten how to be gentle, relearning softness from necessity and desire mixed equally. Iris squealed with delight, squirming between them, and they broke apart, laughing, breathless, the three of them tangled together on the floor in front of the fire, while snow fell outside, and the rest of the city slept unaware. The ring slid onto her finger with ease that felt like confirmation, metal warming instantly to her skin temperature. She stared at it with wonder that made him see the object freshly, not as expensive symbol, but as promise given physical form, as representation of commitment he'd never imagined making, to people he'd never expected to need with this desperate intensity. They stayed there for hours, talking and planning and telling stories, Iris eventually falling asleep curled against his side. The fire burned down to embers that pulsed with residual heat, and eventually they carried the sleeping child upstairs to her room, tucking her into bed surrounded by toys and comfort and security she'd never had before, but would never lack again. In the hallway outside Iris's door, they stood close in darkness broken only by nightlights shaped like stars. The mother looked at him with eyes that held questions she was too tired or too overwhelmed to voice, and he answered them anyway, without words, pulling her close and holding her like she might disappear if he loosened his grip. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest, and he wasn't sure what she was thanking him for. The ring, the proposal, the months of shelter. "Thank you for opening your door when my daughter knocked. Thank you for being someone who could have turned us away but didn't. Thank you for choosing us when you could have chosen emptiness and safety instead. Thank you," he replied, meaning it with intensity that surprised him. Gratitude for her faith in accepting, for Iris's courage in asking. "Thank you for teaching me that strength comes in forms I'd never recognized, in vulnerability offered and accepted, in needs admitted rather than hidden, in building rather than protecting, opening rather than closing doors I'd convinced myself needed to stay locked." The next morning arrived with sunlight on new snow, the world scrubbed clean and bright. He woke to find Iris bouncing on the bed with the energy of a child who knew Christmas waited downstairs, her excitement infectious enough to make even exhaustion feel irrelevant compared to the joy radiating from her small body. They descended together, the three of them, and found gifts that had been acquired without fanfare, wrapped with care. The day unfolded with laughter and torn paper and food prepared by the cook, who'd returned despite being given time off, because she said some traditions deserved proper meals, and she wasn't about to let Christmas pass with frozen food. In the afternoon, word spread among the staff about the engagement. The housekeeper appeared with champagne that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, pouring it with tears in her eyes as she toasted them with words about time and change. Others followed, their congratulations genuine, their acceptance complete, barriers between employer and employee dissolving in shared happiness. As evening fell and Iris played with her new toys by the fire, the mother came to where he stood by the window watching snow begin again. Her arm slid around his waist, her head resting against his shoulder with trust that humbled him more than any show of respect he'd ever commanded, more powerful than any loyalty bought with fear or money, or the complicated transactions that governed his other relationships. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, the question practical beneath its simplicity, acknowledging that promises made in firelight still had to survive in daylight. The world outside these gates won't understand. People will talk, will judge, will make assumptions about why we're here and what you want from us, and whether this is real or just another transaction. "Now we live," he said, surprising himself with the answer, with how completely he believed it, despite knowing she was right about complications that would follow them. "We have breakfast. You teach me how to make those pancakes Iris loves. She goes to school and comes home with drawings. We argue about small things and laugh about smaller things and build something ordinary inside this extraordinary place." She turned in his arms, looking up at him with eyes that still held traces of disbelief that any of this was real. He kissed her forehead, gentle and reverent, sealing promises made in front of fire and witnesses, acknowledging that from this moment forward, his choices would factor in two other hearts beating in rhythm with his own, their needs and safety and happiness more important than empire or reputation. Outside, the city continued its existence unaware that on the hill, in the mansion that had stood empty of love for decades, a family had assembled itself. And inside, as snow fell soft and endless, three people who'd been separate learned to be together. Starting with this moment and extending forward into tomorrow's, they'd build one day at a time, one meal, one laugh accumulated until it became foundation strong enough to last. Thank you all for following this story from the cold morning when a little girl knocked on a gate to this warm evening where a family was born from snow and circumstance. If you've enjoyed watching Iris, her mother, and the man who learned to open his heart find their way to each other, please write in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you stories about hope, second chances, and the power of choosing to help even when it's unexpected.